On the day the earthquake struck, my world didn't just shake, it shattered. My husband, Henry, chose to leave me behind and fly to another city to meet his crush. As I lay trapped under the rubble, surrounded by darkness and fear, I sent him a desperate message. "Henry, there's been an earthquake. I'm buried underground. It's so dark, and I'm scared." Hours later, when I was finally rescued, I sent him 2 more messages before hurling my phone into the ruins. "Henry, I can't hold on anymore. It's a good thing you're busy with work. Otherwise, you'd have died here with me and our child. You being safe is great." But that wasn't the whole truth. I wanted him to think I was dead. I wanted him to carry the weight of guilt, to regret abandoning me and our unborn child. I wanted him to cry at night, haunted by the choices he made. And when the time comes, when hiding is no longer possible, I'll look him in the eye and say, "I want a divorce." Our story didn't start with earthquakes or anger. It started with love. Or at least, I thought it did. In the 2nd year of our marriage, Henry's childhood crush, Eileen, returned from abroad. I was the one who accompanied him to pick her up. I'll never forget the way she looked: long black hair, a flowing white dress, and an elegance that seemed untouchable. She ran to Henry, wrapping herself around him like she belonged there. "Henry, I finally see you again," she said with teary eyes. For a moment, Henry froze, but then he gently touched her head, comforting her. There, everything's fine." Standing next to them, I felt like an outsider in my own marriage. Trying to maintain my composure, I forced a smile and reached for Henry's hand. "All right, now that she's here, let's go." That was the first time Eileen seemed to notice me. She pulled back from Henry, her face showing a mix of surprise and unease. "Henry, you're married?" she asked quietly. He only nodded. The car ride home was awkward, filled with unspoken tension. I learned that Eileen wasn't just Henry's crush, she was his half-sister. Their connection ran deeper than I'd realized. Henry had been adopted into her family after losing his parents in a car accident at the age of 9. While Henry grew up reserved and distant, Eileen was the opposite: cheerful, warm, and unburdened. She became his light, the warmth that thawed his cold childhood. That night, as I cooked dinner, Henry brought home beef and onions. "Eileen loves steak," he said casually. My heart sank. In all our years together, Henry had rarely remembered my preferences, let alone my allergies. "Henry, did you forget? I'm allergic to onions. If I touch them, I break out in rashes," I reminded him, my voice quiet but firm. For a moment he looked surprised, then brushed it off with a smile. "I didn't know. You'll be fine, go rest. I'll cook tonight." But he did know. He'd known since the early days of our relationship. 3 years ago, he even rushed me to the hospital when I accidentally ate onions in a dish he ordered. That memory, once a sign of his care, now felt like a distant, forgotten chapter. During dinner, Henry kept serving me food, trying to smooth over the earlier moment. "The shrimp is good tonight," he said, almost cheerfully. I nodded and ate in silence, my thoughts drowning in the realization of just how deeply Eileen had claimed a part of him, a part he'd never given to me. I ate slowly, feeling the weight of the evening settle over me. When I glanced up, I noticed Eileen smiling softly as she passed me a shrimp. She looked at Henry, then at me, her gesture smooth and natural. "Sister, have some more shrimp. Brother's shrimp is the best," she said warmly. For a moment, it felt like I was the guest in my own home. It had been Henry's idea to have Eileen stay with us. 3 days earlier, he told me his sister was returning from abroad. "She's had a rough time these past few years," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "She was betrayed by her boyfriend, all alone in a foreign country. and now the doctor says she has depression. His lips were tight, and his eyes seemed to hold a deep sadness. I felt a pang of pity for him as he spoke. When he explained that she didn't want her parents to know, and asked if she could stay with us for a while, I didn't hesitate to agree. Back then, I didn't realize that this sister was the same woman Henry had cherished in his heart for years. It wasn't until I saw Eileen's face at the airport that it hit me. I'd seen her picture before, hidden in a book on Henry's shelf. She was the moonlight he'd kept in his heart, the person he had never truly let go of. That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were a tangled mess of Henry, Eileen, and everything I had ignored until now. Henry wrapped his arms around me from behind, his breath warm against my ear. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly. I nodded, unable to speak. He sighed and released me, falling asleep while I lay awake, staring into the darkness. When I stepped out of the room, I found Eileen standing in the living room, her tears falling silently as she trembled. At her feet lay the shattered remains of ceramic dolls' figures that Henry and I had made together at a pottery store when we were dating. I had crafted one of him, and he had made one of me. We'd even etched Henry and Haley together forever on the base. It was a token of our love, and now it lay in ruins. I stared at the pieces on the floor, my chest tightening. Henry, however, looked only at Eileen. Her tear-streaked face and reddened eyes seemed to pull at his heart. "It's just a pair of dolls," he said gently. "No need to cry over it." He sighed and guided her to the couch, furrowing his brows. "How could you be so careless? Look, your foot is scratched." Without a word, I began cleaning up the shards, feeling like a maid in my own home. Eileen sat on the couch, her voice trembling. "Sister, I didn't mean to. She trailed off, her tears falling harder, as if remembering some tragic memory. I didn't respond. Instead, I stepped out onto the balcony, lit a cigarette, and stared into the night. Eileen always called me sister. It was a word that carried no warmth, just a strange mix of innocence and ownership. Earlier that evening, while Henry cooked in the kitchen, she had sat with me in the living room, smiling as she picked up a cat-shaped pillow. "Sister, look at this. I gave this to Brother Henry before I went abroad. I can't believe he still has it." Her words hit me like a blow, and I struggled to keep my expression neutral. My stomach churned as I gripped the unlit cigarette in my hand. Henry had always disliked women who smoked. His type was clear, someone like Eileen, delicate, pure, and fragile. I must have stayed on the balcony too long because Henry eventually came to find me. He took the cigarette from my hand. "Don't smoke. It's bad for you." His tone was gentle, but I couldn't shake the bitterness rising in me. I wasn't even planning to smoke. I couldn't, not while pregnant. He didn't know yet. "What about your sister?" I asked him. He gestured toward the room. "She's asleep." I pressed further, my voice sharper than usual. "Don't you need to keep her company?" He looked confused. "What?" I chuckled dryly, my frustration bubbling over. "Henry, how long is Eileen staying with us?" He hesitated, sensing the shift in my tone. I met his gaze and, for once, let my guard down. "Henry, I don't like your sister. You know, when I was pursuing you back then, there was a night you got drunk. You hugged me and kept calling her name Eileen. At the time, I didn't know who she was, but now I do." I looked Henry in the eyes, my voice firm but trembling with emotion. "Do you really just see her as a sister?" "Henry, ask her to leave. Either she goes or I do. You decide." He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, his face a mix of conflict and frustration. Finally, he sighed deeply. "Haley, what happened just now? Eileen didn't mean it. She's struggling. She has depression. Her emotions are unstable." Can't you try to understand her a little? I know it's unfair to you, but Eileen's parents, and even Eileen herself, have been good to me. Bringing her here wasn't about anything else. The past is the past. I see her only as a sister now. I have you, don't I? His words felt sincere, and for a moment I wanted to believe him. I searched his face, thinking back to all the years we'd shared. We'd first met in high school. Back then, Henry was strikingly handsome and brilliant in class, but distant, almost unapproachable. He always sat in the darkest corner of the room, as if even the light avoided him. Yet, I was drawn to him. I saw something in him that felt familiar. Henry had transferred to our school during senior year, an odd time for such a move. I never saw his parents, not once. It reminded me of my own fractured family. My parents divorced when I was little, and neither of them wanted me. They fought bitterly in court, and custody was granted to my father, though he only provided money and not love. I figured Henry's family situation must have been worse because, even with our demanding final year of high school, he worked part-time at a milk tea shop after school. It broke my heart to see him struggling. Despite his aloofness, I knew Henry had a gentle side. I'll never forget the day I had a fight with my father and cried alone in the garden behind the school library. Henry walked by without saying a word, but he left a pack of tissues beside me. The golden light of dusk shimmered around him, and at that moment, I knew I was in love. I followed him to university, determined to stay close. I pursued him relentlessly for 5 years. I celebrated every holiday with him because he never went home. He liked girls with long hair and white dresses, so I grew mine out and wore the clothes he preferred. He loved home-cooked meals, so I learned to cook just for him. Everything I did was to win his heart. But even then, I could see traces of her Eileen. She had already done so many of the things I was doing for him. I ignored it and worked harder. If she had done it, I would do it better, pouring my heart into loving someone who barely opened up. No one had ever treated me kindly before, so I gave him all the love I had, hoping it would be enough. After 5 long years, I finally won him over. He became mine, and now she was back. I took a deep breath and asked him again, "Even if you can promise me that you only see her as a sister, can you guarantee that Eileen feels the same? Can you be sure she has no other feelings for you?" This time, he hesitated. His silence cut through me. Finally, he said no. He assured me again that it was over, that Eileen was just a sister to him. He said he had already started looking for apartments for her, and promised she'd move out as soon as he found a suitable place. Despite my anger and heartbreak, I chose to trust him for the 8 years we'd shared, and for the child growing inside me. I placed a hand on my belly, a gesture of hope, but quickly pulled it away before Henry noticed. "Henry, these are your words. Don't lie to me. If you deceive me, I promise you'll regret it. I will make you regret it." The day Eileen moved out, the sky was heavy with gray clouds, mirroring the weight in my heart. Together, we helped her pack her things. As the car pulled away, a part of me hoped this chapter would finally close. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Henry and I went with her to move into her new house. She had so many belongings that it took us almost 4 hours to clean and pack everything. By the time we got back, it had started raining. As soon as we walked in, Henry got a phone call from her. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I watched him pause, clearly torn, before he finally responded. After he hung up, he wandered through her old room, grabbed an umbrella, and rushed back out. She had forgotten something important, and I offered to take it to her instead. The rain outside was relentless, and I asked, "Should we go now?" He nodded, but suggested I stay behind. When I insisted on joining him, he smiled, pulled me into a warm embrace, and kissed my cheek. "Don't worry," he said softly. "I'll be back soon." Reluctantly, I stayed. Being pregnant, I knew I couldn't push myself too hard. I waited for a long time, sipping on a glass of water that had grown cold. The rain showed no signs of stopping. Then, a text came through from Henry. "Haley, the rain is really heavy. I'll wait for it to ease up before coming back. I'll bring you your favorite cake when I return." I stared at the message, replied with an okay, and tried to distract myself. But something didn't sit right with me. I found myself heading to Eileen's house. Her front door wasn't fully shut, left ajar with warm light spilling into the dim hallway. I hesitated, my hand trembling on the handle, unable to push it open. Through the gap, I heard muffled sobbing. "Henry," Eileen's voice wavered, thick with emotion. "I miss you so much. All those years I was abroad, I thought about you every day. Don't you miss me too?" My breath caught in my chest. My hand froze on the handle as Henry's voice broke through, firm but strained. "Eileen, you're drunk. Let go of me. Stop this." The sound of a bottle hitting the floor made me flinch. "No," she cried. "You're the one who said you liked me first. You're the one who wanted to be with me. Do you still feel the same? Tell me the truth, Henry. Did you only marry Haley because I was gone?" There was a long, painful silence before Henry finally responded, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "So what if I did? It's in the past." His words hit me like a thunderclap. My heart sank, and I felt like the ground beneath me had vanished. My body was frozen, but my heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. Then, everything went quiet inside, save for a faint, familiar sound. A low groan I knew all too well. Back when Henry and I were happy, he'd make that sound whenever I kissed his neck. I couldn't stop myself. I pushed the door open slightly, just enough to see. There they were, bathed in the warm light of the room. Eileen was kissing him. Henry stood frozen at first, but then, slowly, he closed his eyes. That was it. I couldn't bear it anymore. Covering my mouth to muffle a sob, I turned and ran. My footsteps must have alerted them, because moments later, I heard Henry calling out, "Haley!" "Wait." He chased after me, his voice desperate. Back at home, he kept trying to explain. Over and over, he said it was a mistake, that Eileen was drunk and upset, and he'd only stayed to calm her down. He insisted he didn't mean any of the things he said, and that the kiss wasn't what it seemed. But as I locked the bedroom door and leaned against it, my mind spinning, his words felt hollow. The image of him closing his eyes while she kissed him was seared into my memory. Nothing he said could erase what I'd seen. That night, Henry kissed me and finally said, "Haley, it's all in the past. I have you now." But his words didn't bring me comfort. I slept alone, tossing and turning, lost in my thoughts. By morning, I got up early, opened the door, and found Henry standing there. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and stubble shadowing his chin. His expression was cautious, like a guilty dog afraid of upsetting its owner. I stared at him for a moment, then forced a smile. "I'm hungry. Can you make me some porridge?" My words caught him off guard, but his confusion quickly turned into relief as he smiled back. He probably thought I had forgiven him, but I hadn't. I'd just given up. That sleepless night, I realized something. I'm not the kind of person who only sees others' faults. If anything, life has taught me to hold on to the kindness I've been shown, even in small moments. When I thought of Henry, I remembered the time I had a fever, and he stayed by my side, gently cooling my forehead with a damp towel. I thought of the night he proposed under a sky full of stars, holding me close and kissing me. I remembered how, on the anniversary of his parents' passing, He held me tightly and begged, "Haley, I only have you. Promise me you'll never leave." But I also couldn't forget the hurt. I remembered how he wavered between me and Eileen, how he knew all her favorite foods but forgot my allergies, how he said he loved me, yet his eyes always wandered to her. For 8 years, I gave him my all, but his heart was never fully mine. And now I was tired. So tired. But I was also unwilling to let go, unwilling to walk away after giving so much, only for him to live happily ever after with her. In the days that followed, Henry tried harder. He bought me my favorite cakes, gifted me the latest handbags, kissed my cheek every morning, and spent more time with me. On the surface, he seemed devoted, but Eileen's social media told a different story. In her posts, she shared glimpses of their moments, him buying her medicine, cooking for her, celebrating her birthday. One post stood out, a picture of them from years ago, smiling warmly, paired with a current selfie. In it, Eileen held a bouquet of roses, and behind her, a man in an apron. Henry was busy in the kitchen. Her caption read, "Time flies, but some things never change." Anyone would think they were a happy couple. I stared at the post for a moment, then liked it. A short while later, Henry called. "Haley, are you done with work? Let me pick you up for dinner." "Sure," I replied cheerfully. "Let's get Western food." But inside, I couldn't ignore the bitter truth. He was busy caring for me, yet unwilling to let go of her. I played the role of the trusting wife, pretending not to notice. One evening, while we were lying in bed, his phone buzzed. I heard Eileen's name and asked casually, "Is that Eileen?" "Half asleep," he answered groggily. "Yes. She has a cold and a headache." Then he paused, realizing what he had just said. I smiled and said lightly, "Then go check on her. Just come back early." To my surprise, Henry didn't leave. "She has medicine at home," he explained. "She'll be fine after some rest." Then he turned to me, his eyes filled with disbelief and hesitation. He hesitated for what felt like forever before finally blurting out. Henry shifted in bed as Eileen's voice trembled through the phone. "Can you come see me? I feel so unwell. I think I'm going to die. Nobody loves me. You don't want me either, do you? I'm standing on the rooftop right now." The night was quiet, but the tension in the air was deafening. I lay there, my eyes closed, but every word cut through me like a knife. I could hear Henry exhale sharply, the kind of breath someone takes when they're torn between obligation and guilt. He whispered into the phone, "Eileen, calm down. Don't do anything rash." I acted clueless, shifting slightly to make it seem like I was asleep. But inside, my mind was racing. Why? Why was this happening again? I felt the anger rise in my chest, but I kept my face relaxed, peaceful. He hung up after murmuring a few more words to her. I waited. 1 minute. 2. Then, without opening my eyes, I asked, "What's wrong? Why is your phone buzzing so much?" Henry froze, startled. "It's nothing important." I opened my eyes, pretending to be groggy. "In the middle of the night? What nothing important needs you awake at this hour?" He looked down, guilt creeping into his features. He knew it wasn't right. I smiled softly, my voice calm but sharp. "After all, she is your sister, isn't she, Henry?" He blinked at me, confused, then relaxed slightly, as if I'd given him an out. "Yes, she's just not feeling well." I kept my tone light, almost comforting. "Henry, I've thought it over. I should trust you. People need to look forward, right? Let the past be the past." That seemed to disarm him. He sat back down on the bed, his shoulders relaxing. "Haley, you know I only have you." I nodded, forcing a warm smile. "Of course, Henry. You promised you'd take care of me, that you'd love me for a lifetime. I trust you." Who else would I trust? My voice trembled just enough to sound vulnerable, and I noticed the change in his expression. It was working. He pitied me. He felt guilty, and I knew his guilt was far more dependable than his love. But guilt wasn't enough. Not for what I was planning. I rested my hand on my abdomen, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. A baby. The child we had both dreamed of. He had always wanted children, especially because of our broken families. I remembered the first time we thought I was pregnant. It was a false alarm, but his reaction stayed with me. The way his face lit up, his cautious joy as he lifted me off my feet, only to set me down gently, afraid he might harm me, or the child. For a brief moment, he was purely happy. But this time, I didn't tell him. I had found out I was pregnant weeks ago, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way his mind seemed elsewhere when we talked, the way his eyes drifted like he was half present. Maybe it was Eileen, or maybe it was the fear of what this pregnancy might mean for me, for him, and for us. Now, lying beside him, I felt a twisted satisfaction. What if he knew? What if he realized he could lose the child because of his lies and betrayal? Would he feel the weight of that guilt? Would it break him? The thought was cruel, but I couldn't stop it. I hated myself for even considering it. The next 10 days passed in a haze. Our second anniversary arrived, and Henry planned a trip to celebrate. It should have been a happy time, but the moment we arrived, I began to feel unwell. The baby, who had been so peaceful until now, suddenly made its presence known. At night, as I lay beside Henry in bed, unable to sleep, the silence of the room amplified every sound, every thought, every fear. And then, like clockwork, Eileen called. Her voice was shaky, desperate. "Henry, please, I need you. Nobody loves me. I'm on the rooftop. I can't do this anymore." Henry shot up, panicked, his hand gripping the phone tightly. He murmured soothing words to her, promising to help, trying to calm her down. I closed my eyes, pretending I couldn't hear, but every word echoed in my mind, leaving me wondering how far would this go? How much more could I take? The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as the night stretched on. The wind was howling, and the sky looked so dark. "Will you come and see me?" I heard Henry say. He rubbed his forehead and sighed softly. I stayed still in bed, pretending to be asleep, until he gently nudged me awake and kissed my cheek. "Haley, there's some trouble at work. I need to go back for a bit, but I'll be back tomorrow morning," he told me. Normally, I would have just nodded and played the role of the calm and understanding girlfriend. I always believed everything he said without question. But something felt off. My heart was racing, and for some reason, I couldn't let him go. I acted like I had a nightmare and clung to him, even managing to shed a few tears. "Henry, please don't leave. I just had a bad dream. Don't leave me alone here." But he still left, patting my head and telling me to be good and wait for him to return. Little did I know, he wouldn't come back. At 2 a.m., the earth shook, the house collapsed, and I was trapped under the rubble. The darkness was overwhelming, endless, and suffocating. There was barely any air, just darkness closing in around me. It made me feel small and weak. I thought I had completely given up on Henry, that I was done with him. But as I lay there, unable to move, I realized I was still vulnerable. In that darkness, I sent him a text. "Henry, there's been an earthquake. I'm buried. It's so dark, and I'm scared. Am I going to die? I don't want to die." For the next few hours, I sent him message after message. At first, I was terrified, but as time passed, I felt numb, then full of anger. I kept hoping he'd reply, but he never did. Meanwhile, my friends sent me comforting messages, but I couldn't stop thinking about where Henry was. Was he with Eileen? Maybe he was with her, lying in her arms while I was stuck here, fighting to breathe. The thought made me shudder. I was trapped for 10 hours before they finally rescued me. When I could finally move, I had one more thing I needed to do. I sent Henry 2 final messages, trembling as I typed. Henry, I can't hold on anymore. You're lucky to have work to do, or you would have died here with me and our child. You're really lucky. Then I threw my phone into the rubble. I wanted him to think I had died, to feel the guilt that came with leaving me and our child to die alone. I wanted him to remember it was him who left me, who betrayed me for her. Even at the edge of death, my thoughts were all about him, worrying for him, hoping he would feel haunted by what he had done. When Henry finally saw those messages, it was daylight. The night before, he had found Eileen standing on the rooftop, looking out at the wind that seemed like it could blow her away. She smiled faintly at him. Henry, you're back. I knew you'd still have me in your heart. For some reason, seeing her like that made him feel worn out. It wasn't just sadness, it was guilt too. That night, Eileen clung to him, telling him all the things she had been through. Henry didn't know how he felt anymore. Did he still love her? Maybe, but not like before. He knew he loved Haley. 8 years together made her more than just a girlfriend. She was family. He couldn't bear to leave her, even though it was her who had first chased after him. He couldn't forget Eileen, though. She had been his first love, the one everyone had tried to keep him away from. He knew he should push her away now, but he didn't. He just patted her head and tried to reassure her, telling her not to worry too much. Did you take your medicine today? Do you feel okay? I'll take you to see a doctor. Henry tried to convince himself it was okay. He told himself he was just helping a patient, just taking care of his sister. Haley didn't know anything, and Haley loved him so much. This was just one time, the last time. When he woke up in the morning, the sky was already bright. The alarm clock went off, and without thinking, he grabbed his phone. But when he saw that his scheduled flight had been canceled, his heart sank. Then, a flood of message notifications came through. Finally, he saw Haley's texts, one after another. She said there had been an earthquake. She was trapped underground. It was so dark, and she was so scared. For a moment, he felt like he'd been thrown into an ice-cold pit. Even his hand holding the phone began to shake. He told himself it couldn't be real, it couldn't be happening. But the endless notifications on his phone made it clear it was real. He called Haley, desperately, but the call never went through. He sent more texts, but still there was no reply. Panic started to set in. Fear rushed over him like a violent storm. His face must have gone pale because Eileen walked over, concerned. Henry, what's wrong? She asked, her face calm and unchanged. But as he looked at her, he remembered what he'd been doing the night before, at 2 a.m, when Haley was trapped under the rubble. His face darkened further. He grabbed his coat from the sofa and headed out. Eileen called after him, but he barely heard her. His steps were shaky, and he didn't know where he was going. The flights were canceled, the roads were blocked, and there was no way to reach her. He had nowhere to go. Henry finally made it back home, the home he'd shared with Haley for 3 years. He sat there, numb, refreshing his phone over and over, hoping for a message from her. But none came. 5 hours later, 2 short messages arrived from Haley. Henry, I can't hold on anymore. It's lucky you still have work to keep you busy, or you would have died here with me and the child. You're really lucky to be safe. His heart exploded. A child? He and Haley had a child? He suddenly remembered a few days ago when Haley brought home a package full of baby clothes and toys. He had asked her why she bought them, and she'd just smiled, saying it was for a friend who was pregnant. At the time, he had jokingly asked her when they would have their own child. She had blushed and smiled shyly, looking at him seriously. "Henry, if we have a child one day, will you be a good husband and father?" "Of course I will," he had said. "I'll take care of you, and I'll be better than anyone else. I'll never let you down." The memories flooded back in an instant. He rushed through the house, searching for anything that could remind him of her. The house was full of signs of Haley. On the fridge was a weekly meal plan written in her neat handwriting, and in the closet, all of the clothes were neatly folded. In his study, there were cards she had written for him. "It's been an hour of work. Time to take a break. Remember to drink water." Why had he never noticed these things before? Why had he always taken them for granted? He kept searching, not knowing what he was looking for, until finally, in a drawer, he found it. Along with the children's clothes and toys, there was a thick, old sketchbook. He knew Haley liked to draw, but he had no idea she had secretly drawn so many pictures of him, portraits of their life together. From their first meeting in high school, to falling in love, to getting married, she had captured every moment with her art. The first drawing was so old, showing him reading a book in the classroom. She had written beside it, "The person I fell in love with at first sight." The second drawing showed the moment they first got to know each other. He paused, overwhelmed by the memories and emotions. In one of the drawings, Haley had sketched a girl crying in the garden, with a note that read, "He really is a very gentle person." The third drawing confused Henry for a moment because he didn't remember ever looking like that. But as he read the text next to it, he realized it must have been from their first Chinese New Year together. She had written, "It turns out he, like me, has no home to return to. I really feel so sorry for him. From now on, I will spend every Christmas with him. Although he seems not to need my company, having someone by your side is always a little better, right?" Henry flipped through the pages, and soon he came to a drawing of them together. But there were no people in the portrait, just two well-crafted ceramic dolls. Haley had written beside it, "Our token of love. Although he never told me he liked me, we made ceramic dolls for each other, and he would smile when looking at them. This should also be considered a form of mutual understanding, right? I'll keep this pair of dolls safe. When we get married, have children, and when our teeth are old, I'll still show them to our grandchildren and tell them the story of their grandparents." Henry paused, feeling a sharp pain in his chest. He quickly went to the living room to find the dolls. But when he reached the display cabinet, he remembered that the pair had already been broken. His hand reached out in vain to touch something that wasn't there. With that, he collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. After the earthquake, the area was closed off for 7 days. During this time, Henry did everything he could to find Haley. He sent her countless messages, called her over and over, and even reported her missing to the police. He searched for anyone who might know where she was and went to her parents, but no one had any information. Henry refused to believe that she was gone. Every night, he locked himself in his room, avoiding the rest of the house that was filled with reminders of Haley, her paintings, the decorations, the cushions, and the flowers on the bedside table. Every little thing reminded him of how much she loved him, and how much he loved her. But why had it ended like this? By the 6th night, the flowers by the bedside had started to wilt from neglect. He was the same, lying in bed, flipping through the photo album Haley had left behind. He also reread the messages she had sent him while she was trapped under the rubble. What had she felt during those dark, hopeless hours? She had loved him so much, so intensely. But he had betrayed her, leaving her all alone. He couldn't help but imagine what it must have been like for her, buried underground in the dark, unable to breathe. feeling like she was suffocating. His hand slowly moved toward his neck, as if to understand her pain. Would it feel like this? He squeezed tighter, gasping for air. But then suddenly, he let go. He couldn't die. He couldn't leave things like this. He had to find her. Even in death, he couldn't let go of the thought of being with her. On the 7th day after the earthquake, the roads were cleared and flights resumed. I was hiding in the tent, watching Henry hold my photo and search for me everywhere. He had already asked the person in charge at the site, but they had no news of me. How could they? I didn't want him to find me. After I was rescued, I lied about not having my phone or ID on me when they were taking down my information. I gave them my friend's name and ID number instead. I didn't know how long I could keep hiding from him, but for now, I would stay hidden for as long as I could. I took one last look at his panicked face, then quietly climbed into my friend's car. He looked tired, with stubble and messy hair, but honestly, that didn't matter to me. He deserved everything that was happening to him. I stayed at my friend's house for a week, then finally decided to go out. I went to the hospital for an abortion. By the time Henry found me, I had already gone through the procedure and was lying in the hospital bed. When he saw me, his eyes turned red. He said nothing. I quietly took out the divorce papers I had prepared. "Let's get a divorce," I said. Henry refused to sign. I asked him one question. "Henry, what were you doing at 2:30 in the morning during the earthquake, when I was trapped under the rubble?" I knew everything now. "Sign it. You don't deserve my love anymore." He stood there for a moment, pale as a ghost, but still refused to sign. I think he knew deep down that our feelings were gone and there was no baby between us anymore. This thin piece of paper with our names on it. His lips twisted into a weak smile, but his body trembled. "Haley, let's go home. You've just had the procedure. Let me take care of you." But Lucy, my friend, who'd been taking care of me since the earthquake, stepped in and pushed him away. "How dare you?" Haley's made it clear. "Don't you know what you've done?" I didn't need Henry to take care of me. "I'll take care of Haley," Lucy said firmly. Henry begged me again for forgiveness. "I know I was wrong. I'll change. Will you forgive me? Will you give me another chance?" Another chance? I had already given him plenty. "I trusted you. I believed in you. But what about you?" I asked. Henry was silent. He pulled out an old photo album, his hands shaking. After a long pause, he said, "But Haley, you love me, right?" "No one will ever love me the way you did. If you love me so much, how could you stop?" It was hard to believe he would ask such a thing. I looked at him. My heart no longer stirred. I smiled faintly, grabbed the album from him, and tore it apart. "I loved you once, but that's in the past. I loved you, but who wouldn't be better to love than you? Every word in that album was my true feelings, but you don't deserve them anymore." Over the next few days, Henry came to see me every day. He'd bring homemade soup and knock on Lucy's door. Every time, Lucy would dump the soup in the trash and send him away. After a week, Lucy had enough and called the police to keep him away. For the next half-month, Henry waited for me every day outside the community gate. He quit his job and even left Eileen behind. But I never went down to see him. Then, on my birthday, Henry bought a cake and called me, hoping I'd come see him. He said he'd wait as long as it took. I didn't say anything and hung up the phone. I didn't go to see him. That night, it poured rain. The next morning, Eileen called. She said Henry was in the hospital with a high fever and begged me to visit him. I didn't respond and hung up the phone, but I still went. The hospital smelled of disinfectant, and when Henry saw me, his face lit up. I looked at him, then at Eileen beside him. I slapped them both hard. "What are you doing?" Eileen asked. But before she could push me, I shoved her to the ground. I slapped her again, splashing water on her face. I looked at her coldly and said, one word at a time, "You deserve this. You should be grateful I don't want to argue with you right now. I could have exposed everything about you a long time ago, but I didn't. You always act like you're depressed, like you can't live without Henry. But now, he doesn't want you anymore. Why are you still here? Or was your depression just a lie?" She was silent, her face drained of color. My words hit her hard, and she didn't dare respond. I couldn't be bothered to even look at her anymore. While we argued, Henry just stood there, quietly watching me. It was like he didn't care at all that I had slapped Eileen. He didn't say a word. When I turned to look at him, he gently tugged on my sleeve, his eyes red and filled with hope. "Haley," he whispered. I pulled my sleeve away, frowning. "Henry, you really disgust me," I said slowly. He stammered. "I just feel guilty. I want to make it up to you." I laughed bitterly and threw the divorce papers in front of him again. "Make it up to me? You're just feeling sorry for yourself. I've told you before, in this life and the next, I never want to see you again. Do you understand? No matter what you do, I can never forgive you. Even if you were lying in a hospital, dying, I'd still just feel disgusted. If you really feel guilty, then sign the papers." The light in his eyes finally faded. In the end, Henry signed the divorce agreement. Afterward, I moved out of Lucy's house, changed cities, and started over with a new life. For years, I didn't hear from Henry again. But every Christmas, I would receive mysterious packages filled with jewelry and expensive items. I always returned them. Once, I received a pair of ceramic dolls that looked exactly like the ones Eileen had broken. I smashed them and sent them back. 3 years after the divorce, my career took off, and I met someone new. We hit it off at work, and soon after, we started dating. He was kind and gentle, everything Henry wasn't. He had no messy ex-girlfriends, and he made it clear to everyone that he was completely devoted to me. He rarely drank, and he always made sure to keep a respectful distance from female friends. Even at social events, he would leave early because he knew I liked him home on time. He would say, "Haley, I'm your boyfriend. I have an obligation to control myself and give you the security you need." Our relationship naturally progressed, and we eventually got married. Shortly after that, I heard that Henry was struggling. Since the divorce, he'd been drinking heavily, trying to numb himself. He'd been to the hospital a few times for alcohol-related issues. On the day of my wedding, he drank so much that he ended up with stomach bleeding. His white moonlight had always been by his side, but unfortunately, Henry didn't want her around. I heard she was now dealing with her own depression for real. A few days later, I received an anonymous letter. I recognized the handwriting and knew it was from Henry. I didn't even open it. I just tore it up and threw it in the trash. After all these years, I had moved on. I had my new life, and I didn't want to hear what else he had to say.